This happened to me in the fall of 2023 in the Appalachians. I'd been hiking most of the day, following a loop trail I'd done once before. By the time I turned back toward my campsite, the light was already starting to fade. The sun was low, filtering through the trees in long orange streaks, and the woods were settling into that quiet that comes right before dark. The trail itself was familiar, but everything off to the sides was already blending into shadow. The air had cooled quickly, and I remember thinking I should have started heading back sooner. That's when I saw the deer. It was about 50 yards off the trail, standing just inside the tree line. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Deer are common in that area, and I'd seen several earlier in the day. I slowed down and stopped, more out of habit than concern. Usually they either bolt immediately or freeze for a second before taking off. This one didn't do either. It just stood there, facing me. At first I told myself it was just watching to decide which way to run. But as the seconds passed, something about the scene began to feel wrong. The deer wasn't moving at all. No ear flicks, no tail twitch, no head tilt. It stood perfectly still, like a statue. I remember noticing how thick its neck looked, especially where it met the shoulders. It seemed heavier than I was used to seeing, almost swollen. Its legs were planted stiffly beneath it, straight and locked, like it was bracing itself. I tried to explain it away. Maybe it was injured. Maybe it had been hit by a car earlier and wandered off the road. Or maybe it was just exhausted and confused. Then it took a step toward me. The movement wasn't sudden or reactive. It was slow, deliberate, like it was carefully placing its hoof before shifting its weight. Then it took another step, and another. It wasn't charging. It wasn't startled. It wasn't acting defensive. It was just walking toward me. That's when the unease turned into real fear. Every instinct told me this wasn't normal behavior. Deer don't approach people like that, especially not calmly. I started backing away, keeping my eyes on it, telling myself not to panic. After a few steps, I turned and began walking faster down the trail. After about 10 seconds, I glanced over my shoulder. It was on the trail now, still walking, still facing me, matching my pace. What scared me most was how its head didn't move with the rest of its body. As it stepped over roots and uneven ground, its gaze stayed locked on me. It didn't bob or sway the way an animal's head usually does when it walks. That's when I broke into a run. I didn't stop to look back again. I just ran, heart hammering, lungs burning, my pack bouncing against my shoulders. The trail blurred beneath my feet as I pushed through the last stretch of trees and burst out into the small gravel parking area where I'd left my car. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it immediately. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to slow my breathing. I didn't start the engine. I didn't trust myself to drive while my hands were shaking that badly. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me. I reclined the seat slightly and stayed there for the night, sleeping in short, shallow bursts, and waking up at every sound outside the car. When morning came and the sun was fully up, the fear felt distant, almost embarrassing. In daylight, everything seemed smaller and more ordinary. I told myself I'd overreacted. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I walked back toward my campsite first. Everything was exactly how I'd left it. My tent was untouched. My gear was where it should be. There were no signs of anyone else passing through. Then I walked back toward the spot on the trail where I'd seen the deer. The ground there was muddy from rain earlier in the week, and I didn't have to look hard to find tracks. There were hoof prints, clear and deep, pressed into the mud along the trail. They ran in a straight, single-file line, following the same direction I'd been heading. What caught my attention was the spacing. The distance between each print was wider than I expected. Much wider than what I associated with a deer walking slowly. I stood there for a long time, trying to picture the movement I'd seen the night before and match it to the tracks in front of me. It didn't quite line up. I didn't find any other signs. No scuffed earth, no broken branches. Just the tracks, stretching down the trail until they disappeared onto firmer ground. I don't know what I saw that evening. Maybe the deer was sick. Chronic wasting disease can cause strange behavior. Maybe it was injured or disoriented or reacting to something I couldn't see. Maybe the low light and a long day of hiking made me misread the situation. I'm not an expert on wildlife, but I've seen enough deer to know their basic behavior. I've seen them freeze, bolt, without warning, or stand their ground for a few seconds before taking off. What happened that evening didn't match any of that, and I don't hike at dusk anymore. This happened years ago in a national forest in Colorado. I had a long weekend free, so I decided to go on a solo hike and camping trip, choosing a dispersed camping area that wasn't marked on most maps. I'd stumbled upon it after exploring a few side trails and noticing a small clearing on my map. It wasn't illegal to camp there, just remote enough that most people didn't bother. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked at a small, unpaved turnout and hiked in for several hours, following a faint trail that eventually gave way to open forest. By the time I reached the spot I'd picked, I hadn't seen another person all day. No voices, no headlamps, no distant sounds of engines. Just wind through the trees and the steady rush of a river nearby. I set up my tent in a small clearing and spent the evening doing nothing in particular. I cooked my meal, cleaned up, and sat by the water until it got too cold. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, the sound of the river drowned out everything else. I fell asleep quickly, sometime around midnight. I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into a cold, clear night. The air had that sharp mountain chill that makes you feel instantly awake. The moon was about half full, bright enough to cast pale shadows between the trees. That's when I noticed the light. Through the trees, maybe a couple 100 yards away, was the steady orange glow of a campfire. At first, my reaction was annoyance. I'd gone out of my way to avoid other people, and now someone else was camped close enough that I could see their fire. But the longer I stood there looking at it, the more uneasy I felt. I hadn't passed anyone on the hike in. I hadn't seen headlamps in the distance as night fell. I hadn't heard voices, music, or movement earlier in the evening. And yet, there it was, a fire burning steadily in the woods. I finished up quickly and stayed where I was, watching the glow through the trees. That's when I heard voices. Laughter carried clearly through the still night air. A man's voice at first, loud and confident, followed by a woman's laugh. Then a few more voices layered on top of each other. It sounded like a small group sitting around a fire, talking over one another, the way people do when they're relaxed and comfortable. What confused me was how clear it sounded. I couldn't make out words, but I could distinguish tone and rhythm. The voices seemed closer than the fire looked, like the sound was traveling farther than it should have. I remember thinking that maybe the terrain was funneling the noise toward me, or that I was misjudging the distance in the dark. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to make sense of it. At first, everything sounded normal. People laughing, someone talking loudly, others reacting. But after a while, something shifted. The laughter didn't stop, but it lost its natural flow. It began repeating in short bursts, followed by pauses, then the same bursts again. The tone stayed consistent, but it no longer sounded spontaneous. It started to feel rehearsed. That's when I got the strong sense that I shouldn't be standing out in the open anymore. I went back into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there listening. The voices continued for a long time. Sometimes they sounded farther away, sometimes closer. The laughter would come and go, and underneath it all was the faint crackle of a fire. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, but they were too faint to be sure. The river made it hard to separate real sounds from imagined ones. Eventually, without any warning at all, everything stopped. No voices, no laughter, no crackling fire. Just the sound of the river, exactly as it had been before I noticed the light. Every time I thought I might be drifting off, I'd jolt awake, listening for any sign that the noise would start again. It never did. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up my gear. I moved quickly, not because I felt like I was in immediate danger, but because I didn't want to still be there if anyone else was. My curiosity was fighting with a growing sense of unease. On my way out, curiosity won. I took a wide detour in the direction where I'd seen the fire, carefully picking my way through the trees until I reached a small clearing. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There was a fire ring there. The stones were blackened, but not recently. They were half sunk into the ground, with patches of moss growing between them. The soil inside the ring was cold to the touch. There were no fresh footprints around it, no scuffed earth, no broken branches. I looked for signs of access, worn paths, anything, but there was nothing. No trash, no bottle caps, no food wrappers, no sign that anyone had been there recently at all. I stood there for a long time, trying to line up the clearing with where I'd seen the glow the night before. The distance didn't quite make sense. From where I was standing, the angle felt wrong. Eventually, I gave up and continued hiking out. I still don't know what I heard that night. It could have been people camped much farther away, with sound carrying in strange ways through the forest. It could have been exhaustion, or my sense of direction being thrown off in the dark. The river could have distorted things more than I realized. All I know is that I heard voices where no one appeared to be, and I've never gone back to that place. My first real encounter happened in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. People who haven't been there usually imagine thick forests or rolling hills, but the Pine Barrens are different. It's mostly flat, sandy ground, with dense scrub pines that all look the same once you're deep enough in. The trails twist and fade into each other, and it's easy to lose your sense of direction if you're not paying attention. I hiked in late that afternoon, following an unmarked side trail I'd found on my map. After a few hours, I reached a small clearing near a narrow creek. The water was shallow and slow-moving, just enough to filter and boil for drinking. It wasn't an official campsite, but there were no posted signs, and I hadn't seen another person since leaving the trailhead. According to my map, I was a little over 3 miles from the nearest parking area. It felt isolated in a way I liked. I set up my 2-person tent, collected some dead wood, and cooked a simple dinner rice and tuna on my small backpacking stove. I ate sitting on a fallen log, watching the light fade between the trees. Once it got dark, I cleaned everything up carefully, sealed the food in a bag, and put it in my pack. I left the pack just outside the tent in the vestibule, thinking that was far enough. As night settled in, the woods came alive. Crickets chirped nonstop, frogs croaked near the creek, and every now and then I heard a sharp call from a nightbird I couldn't identify. It was loud, but it was the kind of noise you expect in the Pine Barrens. Familiar, almost comforting. I read for a while by headlamp and eventually fell asleep sometime after midnight. I woke up around 2 a.m, and at first I didn't know why. I lay there, half asleep, trying to place the feeling that had pulled me awake. Then it hit me. The noise was gone. No crickets, no frogs, no water sounds from the creek. Everything had stopped at once. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, like pressure in my ears, the way it feels right before a storm. I lay there staring at the ceiling of my tent, suddenly very aware of my own breathing. That's when I heard something moving outside. It was slow and deliberate, the sound of something heavy crunching through sand and dry leaves. Not the quick darting movements of a raccoon or fox. This was careful. The footsteps moved closer, one step at a time, until they stopped right beside my head. I froze. I could hear breathing now. Deep, wet breaths, like air being forced through a large nose. There was a faint huffing sound, followed by a low snort. I stayed perfectly still, afraid that even shifting my weight would draw attention. Then the side of my tent pushed inward. Not a swipe, not a sudden impact. Just steady pressure, as if something was leaning its weight against the fabric. The nylon stretched until it was only inches from my face. In the dim moonlight filtering through the rainfly, I could see a large, rounded shape pressing against the tent wall. I couldn't make out details, but I knew one thing for certain. It was big. Much bigger than any animal I'd ever had this close to me. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it. That's when I remembered the pack. I'd cooked less than 10 feet from where I was sleeping and packed everything away carefully in my vestibule. But I knew bears can smell food from a long distance, especially on a still night. My stomach dropped. The pressure against the tent shifted. Whatever it was moved slowly along the side, the nylon creaking as it pressed and rubbed. I could hear heavy footsteps circle once, stopping just outside where my pack was stashed. There was a faint scraping sound, like claws dragging against the fabric, followed by a soft thump as it nudged the pack. I clenched my jaw and stayed perfectly still. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a voice in the distance. Someone shouted, sharp and loud, cutting through the silence. The footsteps outside my tent stopped immediately. There was a loud huff, followed by the sound of branches snapping and brush crashing as something large moved quickly away through the trees. The retreating noise faded into the darkness, leaving only silence behind. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, the forest sounds returned. One cricket, then another, then frogs calling from the creek. Even then, I stayed frozen, listening for any sign that it might come back. I didn't sleep again that night. When the sky finally started to lighten, I packed up as fast as I could. My hands shook as I broke down the tent and strapped everything to my pack. Before leaving, I checked the ground around where I'd been sleeping. The ground was churned up, where something heavy had pressed, and the side of my tent was ripped in a few places, the fabric torn where claws had caught it. A few feet away, I saw clear tracks. Later that morning, after reaching the trailhead, I spoke with a wildlife officer. He told me they'd been responding to multiple reports of a black bear wandering campsites along that stretch of forest. Someone else, camping farther down the trail, had likely scared it off when they shouted. That realization made my legs feel weak. If they hadn't been there, if they hadn't made noise when they did, I don't know how long that bear would have stayed, or what might have happened if it decided the tent was worth investigating further. I was lucky. I still camp. I still go into remote places. But I'm a lot more careful now, especially about where I cook and where I sleep afterward. And I never forget how thin a tent wall really is. And if you've had a true scary experience, whether it was a creepy stranger, an unsettling coincidence, or something truly paranormal, I want to hear it. Send your story to the email on your screen and check the description box for details. Your experience may be featured in a future video. Let's share the stories that haunt us. See you in the next video.